Until we fix the cabin, you're staying with me. Those were the first words Tom Underwood said that made me wonder whether taking a summer job at Silver Creek Ranch had been a terrible idea. 48 hours earlier, I had been driving north from Salt Lake City with everything I needed for 8 weeks packed into my Subaru, convinced that Montana was exactly the reset I needed. My name is Ricardo Thorpe. I was 25, burned out from my junior landscape design job, and tired of measuring my life by deadlines, client revisions, and how many hours I could survive on bad office coffee. Silver Creek Ranch sat outside Bozeman, surrounded by open pasture, cottonwoods, weathered fences, and mountains that looked almost unreal beneath the June sky. My temporary job sounded simple enough. Maintain hiking trails, prepare guest cabins, help wherever the ranch needed an extra pair of hands, and photograph the property for a redesigned website. Then I met Tom. He was 26, blonde hair slicked neatly back, athletic enough to make moving 50-pound feed bags look effortless, and so controlled that I couldn't tell whether he disliked me or simply disliked conversation. Salt Lake City, he asked after shaking my hand. Yeah. Ever worked on a ranch? No. He glanced at my clean boots. Figured. I decided immediately that Tom was the kind of boss who formed an opinion before you finished introducing yourself. He apparently decided I was the kind of city guy who would quit after 3 days. Neither of us bothered correcting the other. My first day was mostly orientation, checking cabins, and walking the trail system with a maintenance list. By sunset, my shirt was dusty, my new boots weren't new anymore, and I was beginning to understand why people paid to vacation there. Silver Creek wasn't fancy. It felt lived in, cared for. Tom seemed to know every loose gate hinge and every employee by name. I noticed that, although I wasn't ready to give him credit for it. That night, strong winds moved through the valley. The storm wasn't dramatic enough to frighten anyone, but it knocked branches across the property and kept me awake listening to rain against the temporary bunkhouse where Tom had placed me for my first night. At 7 the next morning, he knocked on my door. We have a problem. A mature cottonwood had dropped a heavy limb across the roof of the employee cabin I was supposed to move into that afternoon. No one had been inside, but the roof needed professional repair before the building could safely be occupied. Okay, I said. Where do I stay? Tom rubbed the back of his neck. Silver Creek was completely booked for the wedding weekend. Most of the guest cabins were reserved back-to-back through the peak summer season, and the bunkhouse was needed by seasonal staff arriving that afternoon. Until my employee cabin passed repair and safety inspections, the only practical long-term option on the property was Tom's house near the main barn. There's space, he said. That sounded reasonable until I carried my duffel inside that evening. The house had a kitchen, living room, small office, and 1 bedroom. I stopped in the doorway. 1 queen-size bed sat against the far wall. I looked at Tom. He looked at me. You're kidding. Believe me, he said, setting fresh towels on a chair. This wasn't my plan either. Before I could answer, something on his dresser caught my attention. A silver picture frame was lying face down beside the lamp, positioned so deliberately that it didn't look accidental. Tom noticed where I was looking. For the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed completely. He crossed the room, and as he picked up the frame, it tilted just enough for me to catch a brief glimpse of Tom standing beside a dark-haired young man. Before I could look more closely, he opened a drawer and put the photograph inside. Some things around here, he said quietly, are better left alone. At that moment, I had no idea who was in that photograph, but I knew one thing. The damaged cabin wasn't going to be the most complicated part of my summer at Silver Creek. Sharing Tom's room sounded simple until we actually had to decide who slept where. He pulled a spare blanket from the closet and announced that he would take the floor. I told him that was ridiculous. The cabin damage was not his fault, and I was not going to spend several weeks watching my employer wake up with a sore back because I had taken his bed. After 10 minutes of pointless arguing, we reached an agreement that felt almost like negotiating a property line. We would share the queen-size bed, use separate blankets, stay on our own sides, and never mention how strange the arrangement was. And no stealing pillows, I added. Tom gave me the first genuine smile I had seen from him. That sounds suspiciously specific. I have brothers. That explains more than you think. The awkwardness faded enough for both of us to laugh, but daylight restored our usual friction. Tom wanted every trail marker checked before noon. I wanted to replace several damaged signs instead of temporarily repairing them. He called that unnecessary. I called it efficient. By lunchtime, we had disagreed about fence posts, guest maps, and whether my photography assignment actually required me to climb a ridge for a better view. Yet I started noticing details that did not fit the impatient ranch owner I had decided he was. When one of the older ranch hands, Frank, needed to leave for a medical appointment in Bozeman, Tom quietly rearranged the afternoon schedule and took over Frank's work himself. When a seasonal employee mentioned that her car was having trouble starting, Tom handed her the keys to the ranch pickup without making a production of it. That afternoon, while we repaired fencing along the north pasture, I finally asked, "Do you ever delegate anything?" Tom drove another staple into the wooden post and glanced at me. "Do you ever stop asking questions?" "Not when people avoid answering them." For half a second, he looked amused. Then he said, "People depend on this place." Something in his voice told me the conversation was over. That night, thunder rolled across the valley sometime after midnight. I woke and realized Tom's side of the bed was empty. Light from the kitchen reached beneath the bedroom door. I found him sitting on the covered porch with a mug of coffee, watching rain sweep across the dark pasture. "Coffee at 1 in the morning?" I asked. "Bad habit." I sat in the chair beside him. After a long silence, Tom admitted that storms made it difficult for him to sleep. Several years earlier, severe weather had damaged barns, fencing, and guest cabins badly enough that Silver Creek had nearly lost an entire season. "That was when things changed," he said. "What things?" His eyes stayed on the pasture. "Everything." Before I could ask more, he stood and carried his mug inside. The next morning, we were already late for breakfast when I followed Tom out of the bedroom, still buttoning the cuff of my work shirt. His Aunt Wendy was walking down the hallway carrying a basket of clean towels. She stopped so suddenly that I nearly walked into her. Her eyes moved from me to Tom, then toward the bedroom behind us. I expected surprise, maybe an awkward question. Instead, Wendy smiled. Tom immediately noticed. "Do not," he warned. "I did not say anything," she replied. "You were about to." "I was about to deliver towels." Tom took the basket from her and headed toward the kitchen, clearly eager to end the conversation. Wendy waited until he was out of hearing range. Then her expression softened. "Do not take his attitude personally," she told me. "Tom takes a long time to trust people." I glanced toward the kitchen. I noticed. She hesitated, as though deciding whether she should continue. Then she looked toward the bedroom where I had seen that hidden photograph the night before. "You are the first person he has let stay in that room since Victor." My stomach tightened. "Who is Victor?" Wendy's smile disappeared. Before she could answer, Tom called her name from the kitchen. She picked up the remaining towels and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway with a name I had never heard before and a photograph Tom clearly did not want me to see. I told myself Victor was none of my business, which would have been easier if Wendy had not made his name sound important. I did not ask Tom about him that morning. Instead, we spent the next several days working on a neglected trail that climbed toward an overlook above Silver Creek. The work gave us plenty of reasons to disagree, but somewhere between replacing trail markers and clearing overgrown brush, our arguments stopped feeling hostile. Tom discovered that I hated raisins and started removing them from the trail mix before handing me the bag. I learned that his serious expression usually disappeared whenever one of the ranch horses tried to search his pockets for treats. He also began leaving coffee for me in the kitchen each morning, always with exactly the amount of cream I preferred. Neither of us mentioned that he had remembered. One afternoon, while I photographed the finished section of trail, Tom looked over the valley and said, "You were right about moving the marker." I lowered my camera. "Could you repeat that? I need evidence." He laughed, and for a moment I forgot he was my employer. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. A few evenings later, we drove roughly 20 miles into Bozeman for hardware, replacement linens, and supplies for the guest cabins. By the time we finished, it was after 7, so Tom suggested dinner at a small downtown restaurant rather than driving back hungry. We were halfway through our meal when our server placed the check between us and smiled. "I will let you two decide who is paying tonight." There was something casual in her tone that made me realize what she had assumed. I looked at Tom, expecting an immediate correction. He simply picked up the check. "Ranch expense," he said. Outside, I finally asked, "You knew what she meant, right?" Tom unlocked the pickup. "Yes." "And you did not correct her?" He looked directly at me. Did I need to? Before I could decide what that answer meant, he climbed into the driver's seat, leaving me standing beside the passenger door with a question I suddenly was not sure I wanted answered. The drive back began quietly. Then I made the mistake of asking about Victor. Tom's hands tightened slightly around the steering wheel. Wendy told you. Only his name. Victor grew up around Silver Creek. We were close. How close? Tom glanced at me. You really do ask too many questions. That ended the conversation. Later, back at the house, I kept to my side of the bed more carefully than usual. Whatever Victor meant to Tom, I had clearly stepped somewhere I did not belong. Tom noticed the distance. Did I do something? He asked. No. That sounded convincing. I stared at the ceiling. After a moment, he surprised me by changing the subject. Why did you really leave Salt Lake City? I could have given him the safe answer about burnout. Instead, I admitted there had been someone there. A relationship that had slowly turned into me adjusting everything about myself to keep another person happy. Eventually, I could not tell whether I was staying because I loved him or because leaving felt like admitting I had wasted years. Tom was silent for several seconds. Sometimes staying can be harder than leaving, he said quietly. The way he said it made me wonder whether we were still talking about me. 2 days later, a black luxury sport utility vehicle came up the ranch road while Tom and I were repairing a gate near the main barn. A man stepped out, probably in his late 20s, dressed far too neatly for ranch work. Tom went completely still. I recognized the man's face immediately from the photograph I had briefly seen before Tom hit it. Victor. He walked toward us with the confidence of someone who knew the property well. Then his eyes settled on me before returning to Tom. So, Victor said, this is why you finally stopped answering my calls. Victor's comment landed harder than it probably should have. Tom did not laugh. He simply wiped the dust from his hands and said, I have been busy. Victor looked around the ranch. You have been busy for 6 months. Then he turned toward me. Tom made the introduction before I could retreat. Victor Weaver, this is Ricardo Thorpe. Ricardo is working here for the summer. Victor shook my hand with an easy smile. Nice to meet you. There was nothing openly unfriendly about him, which somehow made my assumptions worse. He knew where Wendy kept the iced tea without asking. He greeted Frank by name. He even knew which cabinet in Tom's kitchen held the coffee mugs. By dinner, I felt less like a temporary employee and more like someone who had accidentally walked into the middle of a history everyone else understood. Victor had not come for a social visit. Silver Creek had received a purchase offer from a development company interested in converting part of the property into an upscale resort community. Victor worked in commercial finance and had come to review the numbers. The offer was large enough to make selling difficult to dismiss. We are not selling, Tom said before Victor had finished explaining it. Victor remained calm. You cannot make that decision based on pride. It is not pride. Then show me a plan that keeps this place profitable. Tom had no answer. That was when I understood something he had never told me. Silver Creek was in genuine financial trouble. Later, Victor spread several reports across the dining table. I stayed out of the discussion until I heard Tom mention declining bookings and rising maintenance costs. Suddenly his obsession with fixing everything himself made sense. Every repair he handled personally was money the ranch did not have to spend. The realization unsettled me because I had spent weeks interpreting responsibility as arrogance. Then Victor said something that caught my attention. You cannot keep sacrificing your entire life because you think this place is your responsibility. Tom immediately glanced toward me. Victor stopped talking. Whatever he had almost revealed, I knew it was not about ranch finances. That night, Victor stayed in Wendy's guest room, and Tom barely spoke as we prepared for bed. I told myself to ignore it, but curiosity won. Does Victor want you back? Tom turned toward me. Back where? You know what I mean. His confusion lasted several seconds before understanding finally reached his face. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. You think Victor and I were together? Heat climbed into my face. When he said I was the first person you let stay here since him. There was a photograph. He shows up acting like he knows everything about you. It was not an unreasonable conclusion. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, still smiling. Victor is my foster brother. His mother died when he was 16. My parents took him in until he finished high school, and he stayed part of the family. I stared at him. Your foster brother? Yes. You could have mentioned that. You could have asked without sounding jealous. I looked away. I was not jealous. Tom's smile faded into something quieter. Neither of us challenged the lie. The next morning, while Tom was checking irrigation lines, I opened my laptop in the ranch office and found an email from my former firm in Salt Lake City. They wanted me back. Better salary. Better title. They needed an answer before the end of summer. I was still reading when Tom stepped into the doorway and saw the company name on my screen. He said nothing, but his expression closed instantly. That evening, the distance between us returned. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since Victor arrived. If Victor was not the person you cared about, was there someone else? Tom stared toward the dark window for a long moment. Yes. What happened? His voice dropped. Nothing. That was the problem. I waited. Tom finally looked at me. The guy I wanted never knew. Then he turned off the bedside lamp, leaving me with one thought I could not shake. Tom had just admitted there had been a man he wanted, but he had carefully avoided telling me whether that story was actually over. For the next few days, neither Tom nor I mentioned the man he had once wanted, and I did not mention the offer waiting in my inbox. Instead, we buried ourselves in work. Victor's financial review had made one fact impossible to ignore. Silver Creek needed a new source of revenue. The answer came to me while I was photographing an abandoned wooden pavilion on a hill above the guest cabins. The structure was weathered but solid, and the view stretched across open pasture toward the mountains. I could already picture what it might become. That evening, I covered Tom's dining table with sketches, cost estimates, and photographs. You already host guests, I explained. You have the scenery, the cabins, the kitchen, and enough open space. Restore the pavilion and market Silver Creek for small weddings, retreats, and photography weekends. Tom studied my drawings. With what money? We reuse what we can. Repair instead of replace. I can handle the site design, and the crew can work on it between priority jobs. That still costs money. Less than selling the ranch. That got his attention. The next morning, Tom walked the hill with Victor and me. Victor asked practical questions about insurance, permits, capacity, and projected revenue. I did not pretend the idea was guaranteed to work. I showed them what could be tested without committing the ranch to a major investment. Finally, Victor nodded. It is the first proposal I have seen that gives you another revenue stream without changing what Silver Creek actually is. Tom looked at me differently after that. All right, he said. Show me what we can save. We spent the following week repairing railings, sanding usable boards, clearing the surrounding path, and measuring the site for improvements that would need licensed contractors later. Other employees volunteered when their regular work allowed it. Wendy started calling the project Ricardo's Hill until I threatened to redesign her kitchen as revenge. Tom laughed harder than the joke deserved. More importantly, he began asking for my opinion before making decisions. One evening, while we stood beneath the pavilion roof watching the sun drop behind the mountains, he said, "My father always believed keeping Silver Creek meant keeping it exactly the way it was." And you believed him. For a long time, I ran my hand along one of the restored posts. Preserving something does not mean refusing to let it evolve. Tom went quiet. When I looked over, he was not studying the pavilion. He was looking at me. For one suspended second, I wondered whether we were discussing the ranch at all. A few nights later, Silver Creek held its annual summer cookout for guests and staff. After the tables were cleared and everyone drifted back toward the cabins, Tom and I stayed at the pavilion overlooking the valley. He asked whether Salt Lake City had contacted me, so he had noticed the email. They offered me my old job back, I admitted. Better position. Tom nodded, but his expression gave nothing away. Are you taking it? I have not decided. You wanted a fresh start. Maybe I did not know what that meant yet. Our hands rested on the bench between us, only a few inches apart. Tom glanced down, then back at me. Ricardo, there is something I should have told you about the guy from college. Before he could continue, headlights appeared on the ranch road below. A dark pickup came through the gate and stopped near the main house. Tom stood immediately. That is my father's truck. His surprise worried me more than the arrival itself. You were not expecting him? No. By the time we reached the house, Robert Underwood was already speaking with Victor. Tom's father greeted me politely, then turned to his son with the exhausted certainty of someone who had already made a difficult choice. We need to talk about the offer, Robert said. Tom's face tightened. There is nothing to discuss. Robert looked toward the dark outline of the ranch, then back at him. There is now. I came home because I think we should sell Silver Creek. Robert's decision did not turn into the argument I expected. That almost made it worse. The four of us sat around Tom's dining table, while Victor opened the financial reports again and Robert explained why the development offer deserved serious consideration. Silver Creek had survived difficult seasons before, but maintenance costs were rising. Several buildings needed major work, and one successful summer would not erase years of thin margins. Selling does not mean we failed, Robert said. Tom leaned back in his chair. It means we stopped trying. Robert shook his head. You have been trying since you were 21. I am asking whether this is still your dream or simply the responsibility you inherited. Tom did not answer. I stayed quiet because this was a family decision, but Robert surprised me the next morning by asking to see the pavilion. I showed him the restoration work and explained the event concept, including the parts that still required permits, professional inspections, and more detailed budgeting. He listened without dismissing any of it. On the walk back, he said, You have gotten Tom to consider changes I could not get him to consider for years. I think he just needed a reason. Robert stopped beside the fence. That is what worries me. I waited. My son has spent most of his adult life confusing love with obligation. To this ranch, to this family, sometimes to people. His meaning was impossible to miss. I am not asking you anything about your relationship with him, Robert continued. That is his business. I am telling you that Tom deserves to choose a life, not inherit one. The words stayed with me all afternoon, especially because Salt Lake City was still waiting for my answer. I had less than 48 hours left. I had not told Tom about the deadline because I did not want him to feel responsible for my decision. That choice seemed reasonable until that evening. I was in the ranch office reviewing pavilion estimates when Tom walked in holding a printed page. My stomach dropped when I recognized the Salt Lake City firm's logo. The printer was out of paper, he said. I loaded it, and this came through from the queue. I had printed the offer earlier and forgotten about it. Tom, I was going to tell you. When? After you packed? I have not accepted it. You have a deadline tomorrow. His voice stayed controlled, but that somehow hurt more than anger would have. I did not tell you because this decision needs to be mine. Of course it does. Then why are you acting like I betrayed you? He looked at me for a long moment. Because I thought this summer meant something. It does. Then why does every important conversation with you happen after I discover it myself? The unfairness of that hit a nerve. You want honesty? Fine. You hide behind this ranch every time something becomes personal. You almost told me something at the pavilion. Then your father arrived, and suddenly it disappeared. Tom's expression hardened. This is not about that. It is exactly about that. You keep acting like I am already leaving, but you have never given me a reason to believe you want me to stay. The room went completely still. For 1 second, I thought he would finally say it. Instead, Tom looked down at the offer in his hand and placed it carefully on the desk. I cannot ask you to give up an opportunity for me. I did not ask you to. Then maybe Salt Lake City is where you should be. That was the moment something in me gave way. The next morning, I packed my suitcase before breakfast, when he found me carrying it toward my Subaru and stared at me. Your contract has 3 weeks left. I know. Does Tom know? I looked toward the main house. He will. I had just opened the rear hatch when the screen door behind me swung open. Tom stepped onto the porch, saw the suitcase in my hands, and stopped. Neither of us spoke. Then his eyes shifted to my car keys, and I realized there was no misunderstanding left to hide behind. Tom came down from the porch slowly, but he did not ask me to unpack. That told me more than any argument could have. You are really leaving? He asked. I think we both need some space. Your contract is not finished. I will cover any reasonable costs the ranch has because I am leaving early, and I will send Victor every file for the pavilion. Tom looked almost offended by how professional I sounded. Maybe that was the point. This is not about the contract, Ricardo. Then what is it about? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There it was again, the same wall appearing exactly when I needed him to step through it. I put my suitcase into the Subaru. That is what I thought. I drove into Bozeman without knowing whether I was heading back to Salt Lake City. Instead, I checked into a modest motel near downtown and asked the Salt Lake City firm for the remaining day to consider their offer. For the first time in weeks, I had a room completely to myself. I should have enjoyed the privacy. Instead, that night I kept waking and instinctively looking toward the other side of a bed that suddenly felt too large. Back at Silver Creek, things were moving without me. Victor called the next afternoon, not to pressure me into returning, but because he needed permission to show Robert the financial projections I had created. I agreed. A few hours later, when he sent a short message telling me Robert had contacted several former guests and local businesses about possible fall events. By evening, Victor called again. You might want to sit down. The ranch had received 3 serious inquiries for autumn weddings and 2 requests from local companies interested in small retreats. None of them were confirmed bookings yet, but it was the first evidence that the pavilion concept had a real market. Tom must be happy, I said. Victor was quiet. That is the problem. He barely reacted. I knew better than to ask why. Victor told me later that he had found Tom sitting alone at the pavilion after sunset. You are doing it again, Victor had told him. Tom apparently knew exactly what he meant. Years earlier, in college, Tom had cared deeply about a close friend and never said anything because he was afraid of changing the life everyone expected him to live. The friend eventually moved away, never knowing. Victor had been the only person Tom told afterward. You spent years regretting what you did not say, Victor reminded him. Now you have found someone else who matters, and you are repeating the same mistake. The following afternoon, I was reviewing bus schedules to Salt Lake City when someone knocked on my motel door. I assumed it was housekeeping. When I opened it, Tom stood in the hallway wearing the same work shirt he had worn that morning. Dust still marked his boots. He had driven straight from the ranch. How did you find me? Victor. Of course. Tom took a breath. I am not here because of the pavilion. I said nothing. And I am not here because Silver Creek needs you. His voice was steadier than his expression. Then why are you here? He looked directly at me. Because I finally understand something my father has been trying to tell me for years. There is a difference between needing someone and choosing them. My hand remained on the door. Which one am I? Tom did not hesitate this time. That is what I came here to tell you. For the first time since I had met him, there was nowhere left for either of us to hide. Tom stood outside my motel room for several seconds before speaking, as if he had spent the entire drive rehearsing the words and had finally decided not to use any of them. I choose you, Ricardo. There was no dramatic speech behind it, just a sentence he had apparently been afraid to say. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. Tom leaned against the railing overlooking the parking lot. The guy I told you about from college was named Aaron. He was my closest friend there. I cared about him, but I never told him. I kept thinking there would be a better time. What stopped you? Me. Tom looked embarrassed by the simplicity of the answer. My father needed help at Silver Creek. I knew I was coming home. I had convinced myself that my life had already been decided, so telling Aaron felt pointless. He moved to Spokane after graduation. We stayed friends for a while, then life moved on. And he never knew? Not for me. Tom shook his head. I promised myself I would never do that again. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. Then you showed up, and apparently I learned nothing. I wanted to make it easy for him, but that would have defeated the reason I left. What exactly are you asking me for? Tom faced me. Not your design plan. Not 3 more weeks of work. I am asking whether there is a chance for us after your contract ends. The distinction mattered. More than he knew. I turned Salt Lake City down this morning, I said. Tom stared at me. Because of me? No. His surprise almost made me smile. That is important, Tom. I turned it down because going back would mean returning to the life I left. But I am not staying at Silver Creek as an employee because I have feelings for my boss either. His expression shifted as he understood. Then we changed the arrangement. After the contract, he agreed. We stood there looking at each other, and for once neither of us needed to fill the silence. Tom drove back that evening. I returned the following morning, not because everything was solved, but because I had made a commitment to finish the summer job and wanted to leave the professional part of our relationship clean. When he saw my Subaru and smiled without saying a word, Victor was less restrained. I assumed someone finally developed communication skills. Tom pointed toward the barn. There are stalls that need cleaning if you are bored. The next 3 weeks passed differently. Tom and I still worked together, but we stopped pretending there was nothing between us. We also kept clear boundaries while I remained on payroll. Meanwhile, the employee cabin. Repairs were completed. On the final evening of my contract, Tom carried the last box of my belongings across the yard and set it inside the repaired cabin. There, he said, you officially have your own room again. I looked around at the fresh ceiling, new paint, and neatly made bed. 2 months earlier, this was exactly what I had wanted. Now it felt strangely temporary. That night, after dinner, I walked back to Tom's house to return a ranch key that belonged to the seasonal staff set. He was standing in the bedroom doorway when I handed it over. "Your cabin is ready," he said, almost cautiously. "I know." His eyes moved toward the bed and then back to me. For the first time, circumstance was not making the decision for either of us. I smiled. "My employment ended at 5 o'clock, remember?" I said. Tom glanced at the clock, then back at me, and a slow smile replaced the uncertainty on his face. "I remember." He stepped closer, giving me every chance to change my mind. I did not move away. "And for once," Tom said softly, "I am right on time." I barely had time to smile before he leaned in and kissed me. It was gentle and brief, more question than declaration, and when he pulled back, I stayed close. "You took long enough," I whispered. Tom laughed quietly. "I know." This time I closed the distance myself and kissed him again, with none of the uncertainty I had carried for weeks. Tom understood, and the relief on his face said everything. The next morning, however, Robert asked every family member and senior employee to meet at the pavilion, and he specifically asked me to join them because the pavilion plan was part of the decision. Victor was already there holding a folder from the development company. Robert waited until everyone had gathered, then said, "I have made my final decision about Silver Creek." Tom reached for the back of an empty chair, and I realized our future was about to be decided by something neither of us could control. Robert let the silence settle before placing one hand on the folder Victor had brought. "We are rejecting the development offer." Tom exhaled, but Robert raised a hand before anyone could celebrate. "There is something else you need to know." Years earlier, when Silver Creek first began struggling financially, Robert had transferred a substantial ownership share into a family trust designed to protect the ranch from being sold impulsively during a difficult season. Tom had always assumed the property would eventually become his responsibility alone. It would not. Robert explained that he had deliberately avoided promising Tom complete control because he wanted his son to decide whether he truly wanted Silver Creek or merely felt obligated to carry it. "So I am asking you now," Robert said. "If nobody expected this from you, would you still choose it?" Tom looked across the pavilion, then toward me. "Yes, but not if keeping it means giving up everything else." Robert smiled. "That is the first answer you have given me in years that sounds like your own." The ranch would remain with the family, while Tom would take a larger management role under a formal plan developed with Victor. The pavilion project would move forward carefully, beginning with limited events rather than risking money Silver Creek did not have. By October, the cottonwoods had turned gold, and the restored pavilion hosted its first small wedding. The early bookings had not magically erased every financial problem, but they had created enough new revenue to prove the idea could work. I had started my own landscape and hospitality design business in Bozeman, and Silver Creek became my first major client under a real contract negotiated through Victor. Tom was no longer my employer. He was simply Tom, which turned out to suit both of us much better. Victor returned for the wedding with his partner, Tamati, and finally explained the old photograph. The photograph had come to mean something important to Tom because Victor had been the first person in his family he trusted enough to tell about Aaron. To Tom, it represented the person who had known his secret and never treated him differently. Tom had hidden it from me because explaining it would have required admitting a part of himself he still had not learned to discuss easily. After the wedding guests left, Tom and I walked back toward the ranch house. Beneath a cold Montana sky, the repaired employee cabin stood across the yard, perfectly usable and completely empty. "All of this because a cottonwood damaged your roof," Tom said. "No," I replied. "All of this because you only had one bed." He laughed. "We have 3 guest cabins available tonight." I looked toward the bedroom window. "Still only need one." Tom stopped walking. For a second, I wondered whether I had finally managed to leave him speechless. Then he reached for me, and I went willingly into his arms. Our kiss began with a smile and deepened as we held each other beneath the fading Montana sky. When we finally pulled apart, Tom rested his forehead against mine and laughed softly. I slipped an arm around his waist, and he drew me closer as we started toward the ranch house together. Behind us, the repaired cabin stood empty beneath the cottonwoods. Ahead, the windows of the ranch house glowed warmly as the last orange light disappeared beyond the fields. Neither of us hurried. We walked on with our arms around each other, toward the home we had chosen and the life we were finally free to build together. Months earlier, sharing that room had been an inconvenience neither of us chose. Now staying beside Tom was something I could choose freely, without needing a job, a damaged cabin, or an excuse. Silver Creek had survived, but it had changed. So had we. Perhaps some of the most important choices in life become clearer only when obligation is removed from them. There are times when staying can look like loyalty even when it is really fear, just as leaving can look like freedom when it is only another way of avoiding what matters. Ricardo and Tom did not find certainty overnight. They learned, slowly, that a meaningful life can make room for responsibility without allowing responsibility to define every decision. This story also reminds us that honesty does not always arrive as a dramatic confession. Sometimes it begins with something quieter, admitting what we want, allowing another person to know us, or recognizing that changing direction does not erase where we came from. Perhaps the places and people worth keeping are not the ones that ask us to remain exactly who we were, but the ones that leave enough room for us to become someone new. If you had been in Ricardo or Tom's position, which choice would have been hardest for you to make? What part of their journey made you think differently about choosing between responsibility, opportunity, and the person you want beside you?